I stopped with my hand still on the door handle because something felt wrong. The house was supposed to be quiet at that hour, but instead I heard low voices slipping through the cracks of the old wooden door. Not laughter, not the television, whispers, careful ones. I leaned back, heart pounding, and pressed myself against the wall beside the door frame, suddenly afraid of making even the smallest sound. Then I heard my sister's voice, sharp and certain, cutting through the hush. "We don't need her anymore." The words hit me so hard I felt dizzy. I held my breath, every muscle locked, as if moving would give me away. A pause followed, long enough for hope to flicker stupidly in my chest. Maybe I misheard. Maybe she meant something else. Then my father spoke, his voice lower, colder, the way it only sounded when he was talking about things he didn't want traced back to him. "We have to find a way to get rid of her before she finds out the truth." My vision blurred. My name wasn't spoken, but there was no doubt who they meant. Me. I stood there in the dark hallway, realizing that whatever was happening inside that house wasn't just about money or stress or another family argument. It was about removal, timing, damage control. And suddenly the question wasn't why they were whispering. It was what they were hiding that made my existence such a threat. For a few seconds I couldn't move. My fingers trembled against the peeling paint, my pulse roaring in my ears. This wasn't anger I felt first. It was fear. Real, animal fear. The kind that tells you you've stepped into something dangerous without meaning to. I replayed my father's words again and again. "Before she finds out the truth." That sentence carried weight, planning, urgency. It meant something had already happened. Something big enough that they needed me gone before I learned about it. I stayed frozen until I heard chairs scrape and footsteps shift, the whispers dissolving into normal household sounds. That was when instinct took over. I straightened my back, forced my breathing to slow, and wrapped my hand firmly around the door handle. Whatever they were planning, they couldn't know I'd heard them. Not yet. I pushed the door open and stepped inside. The living room lights were too bright, the smiles too fast. My sister looked up from her phone with a cheerfulness that didn't reach her eyes. My mother jumped slightly, then immediately launched into a sigh about how tired she was. My father didn't look at me at all. He was standing near the table, shuffling papers he clearly hadn't been touching a moment earlier. "Hey," I said, keeping my voice neutral. "Long day?" my mother asked, already nodding as if she knew the answer. "We were just talking about how stressed everyone's been." Talking. Right. I moved further into the room, every sense on high alert. The house felt different now that I knew what had been said inside it. Like I'd stepped onto a stage mid-performance. Everything felt rehearsed, controlled. I watched my sister out of the corner of my eye as she crossed her legs and smiled at me. That familiar smile she used when she wanted something. "I was worried about you," she said lightly. "You've been so busy lately." Busy. That was one word for it. For years, I'd been the reliable one. The one who stayed late at work, picked up extra shifts, covered gaps without being asked. I paid bills when they were short, smoothed over conflicts, swallowed frustration because keeping the peace felt easier than fighting it. I told myself this was what family did. You showed up. You sacrificed. You didn't keep score. Standing there now, I realized how wrong I'd been. My father finally cleared his throat. "We should sit down later and talk," he said, still not meeting my eyes. "There are some things we need to sort out." Something about the way he said it made my stomach tighten. Not a conversation, a process, a decision already made. I nodded. "Sure, later." As I walked past them toward the hallway, I felt their gazes follow me, measuring, calculating. I closed my bedroom door behind me and leaned against it, my hands shaking now that I was alone. The words echoed in my head louder than before. "We don't need her anymore. Get rid of her, before she finds out the truth." I tried to tell myself I was overreacting. Families said cruel things in moments of stress. Maybe I'd stumbled into half a conversation. Maybe the truth wasn't what my mind was already shaping it into. But deep down, another voice was speaking. calmer and far more convincing. The voice that had kept me safe more times than I liked to admit. This wasn't an argument. It was a plan. I sat on the edge of the bed and stared at my hands, realizing something fundamental had shifted. I could never unhear what I'd heard. Whatever the truth was, it existed without me, and that alone told me everything I needed to know about where I stood in this family. I wiped my palms on my jeans, stood up, and took a steady breath. If they thought I was still unaware, still compliant, they were mistaken. I wouldn't confront them, not now. I wouldn't ask questions that warned them I was paying attention. I would watch, I would listen, and I would find out exactly what they were so afraid of me knowing. I slept lightly that night, waking at every small sound. My body braced as if something were about to happen. When morning came, the house felt unnaturally calm, the kind of calm that comes after an argument everyone pretends never happened. I stepped into the kitchen and was met with smiles that were a little too quick, voices a little too bright. My mother stood at the counter, already sighing before I said a word. "I didn't sleep at all," she announced. "So much on my mind lately. You know how it is when you're worried about the family." I nodded, poured myself a cup of coffee, and waited. My sister slid into a chair across from me, scrolling through her phone. "You've been working non-stop," she said without looking up. "You should really slow down before you burn yourself out." The concern sounded rehearsed. Last night, those same people had been discussing how to get rid of me. This morning, they were worried about my health. My father entered last, adjusting his watch, already dressed as if he had somewhere important to be. He glanced at me briefly, then focused on his coffee. "We'll need to talk later," he said again, repeating the same line from the night before. "There are some responsibilities we all need to be clear on." Responsibilities. The word landed with weight. As the morning unfolded, I noticed how carefully they moved around me. Conversations stopped when I entered a room. My sister left to take calls outside, lowering her voice the moment she spotted me nearby. My mother kept finding reasons to remind me how much strain everyone was under. The house felt like it was holding its breath. By lunchtime, the pressure began. "We got another notice," my mother said, placing a folded envelope on the table between us. "Utilities. They're not going to wait forever." I unfolded the paper slowly. It looked urgent, highlighted in red, the kind of thing meant to trigger panic. I'd seen versions of it before. "How much?" I asked. "A lot," she replied quickly. Too quickly. "More than we expected." My sister finally looked up from her phone. "We all need to pitch in," she said. "That's what families do." There it was, the unspoken rule I'd lived by for years. I glanced at my father, who gave a small nod, as if the matter were already settled. I could have argued. I could have pointed out how often I'd covered expenses, how often my contributions had gone unquestioned. Instead, I kept my face neutral. "I'll take a look," I said, folding the notice again. Their shoulders relaxed, just slightly. It told me everything. They weren't asking. They were checking to see if the old version of me was still there. Later that afternoon, I decided to test them. "I heard something interesting at work," I said casually while my mother washed dishes. "Someone mentioned a few properties nearby might be changing hands soon. Development stuff." She didn't even pause. "Oh, that's just talk," she said, her voice sharp. "People love to exaggerate. You shouldn't listen to that nonsense." From the living room, my sister scoffed. "Yeah, like we'd be that lucky." My father cleared his throat and turned up the television. Their reactions came too fast, too clean. No curiosity, no follow-up questions. Just denial. It made my skin prickle. If it really were nonsense, there would have been confusion, maybe even interest. Instead, there was a wall. That evening, my sister cornered me in the hallway. "You've been quiet today," she said, studying my face. "Everything okay?" "I'm fine," I replied. She tilted her head, eyes narrowing just a touch. "You know, stress can make people imagine things." There it was. Not an accusation, a suggestion, a seed planted carefully, as if preparing the ground. "I'm not imagining anything," I said evenly. She smiled, but it didn't reach her eyes. Of course not. At dinner, the conversation turned to the future. My father spoke about timelines, about how certain decisions couldn't be delayed. He didn't specify what decisions. He didn't have to. My mother chimed in with comments about stability, about how important it was not to complicate things during sensitive times. I listened, nodded when appropriate, and watched them closely. The three of them moved like a unit now, finishing each other's sentences, correcting each other in subtle ways. It felt coordinated. At one point, my father glanced at me and said, "We just want what's best for everyone." Everyone, not me. That night, back in my room, I replayed the day piece by piece. The urgency, the rehearsed concern, the way my sister's tone shifted whenever I spoke. I realized something then that made my chest ache. This wasn't sudden. This wasn't a bad week or a misunderstanding. This was a pattern I'd ignored for years. I'd been useful, reliable, predictable. And now, somehow, I was inconvenient. I sat on the edge of my bed and stared at the door, remembering how easily they'd talked about removing me from their lives, as if I were an obstacle, not a person. The fear from last night was still there, but it was changing, settling into something colder, clearer. If they believed I was still unaware, still playing my role, they would continue exactly as they were. And that gave me time. I decided then that I wouldn't volunteer another word. I wouldn't defend myself or demand explanations. I would listen. I would observe. I would let them show me who they really were, without interference. Whatever truth they were hiding, it had already changed the rules of this family. And until I understood it fully, I would pretend I hadn't heard a thing. The sentence wouldn't leave my head. I heard it while brushing my teeth, while driving to work, while lying awake at night staring at the ceiling. Before she finds out the truth. The way my father had said it told me everything. Whatever the truth was, it wasn't emotional. It wasn't about feelings or misunderstandings. It was something concrete, something that could be discovered, documented, and taken away. Money has that effect on people. Once I started looking at things through that lens, the cracks became impossible to ignore. The numbers they complained about didn't add up. The panic never matched the reality of the house we lived in, or the things my sister suddenly had no trouble affording. For years I'd accepted their explanations without question. I told myself families struggled differently, that I shouldn't pry, that helping was easier than doubting. Now I wondered how much of that story had ever been true. I started small, careful not to draw attention. I checked the mail when I got home before anyone else did, sorting through envelopes quickly and putting everything back exactly where it had been. Most of it was routine, but then I noticed gaps, statements that should have arrived and hadn't, official-looking envelopes that disappeared overnight. It felt less like disorganization and more like editing. One afternoon, while my mother was out and my sister was locked in her room on the phone, I opened the desk drawer in the living room where my father kept paperwork. I didn't rummage. I scanned. There were folders I recognized and a few I didn't. One had a label with a company name I'd never heard before. Another had a date circled in red that meant nothing to me yet. I closed the drawer exactly as I'd found it, my heart pounding. That night at dinner, I watched them with new eyes. My sister was distracted, her leg bouncing under the table. My father checked his phone more than usual, turning the screen away from me each time. My mother kept steering the conversation toward how fragile everything felt, how one wrong move could ruin them. They were bracing for something. I decided to test the water again, this time more precisely. "Do we still have the old property papers?" I asked casually, as if the thought had just occurred to me. I was cleaning my closet and realized I've never seen them. The reaction was immediate. Too immediate. My father stiffened. "Why would you need those?" "No reason," I said quickly. "I was just curious." My sister laughed, a little too loud. "You're always curious about weird stuff." My mother jumped in, waving her hand dismissively. "Those are boring documents. Nothing you need to worry about." Nothing you need to worry about. I nodded and dropped it, but my chest tightened. They hadn't asked why I was curious. They hadn't explained. They'd shut it down like a reflex. Later that night, I sat on my bed and went through my bank app, scrolling back months. I wasn't looking for anything specific at first. Just patterns, regular payments, gaps. Then I saw it. A deposit I didn't recognize, dated a few weeks back, labeled vaguely enough to mean anything. It wasn't huge, but it wasn't nothing either. It wasn't mine. I stared at the screen until my eyes hurt. That was when it hit me. I wasn't just being excluded from conversations. I was being excluded from decisions that directly affected me. Decisions that involved money, property, and timing. Decisions that made my presence inconvenient. The next few days confirmed it. My sister suddenly stopped asking me for help with expenses, which should have felt like relief. Instead, it felt suspicious. My parents argued in low voices behind closed doors more often, and when I entered the room, the arguments stopped. Once, I caught my father saying my name under his breath like it was a problem he needed to solve. The gaslighting crept in quietly. My mother asked if I was feeling anxious lately. My sister joked that I seemed paranoid. My father suggested I take some time off work because I looked tired. They weren't worried about me. They were managing me. I almost convinced myself to let it go, almost told myself that families handled finances however they needed to, that not everything was my business, that confronting them would only make things worse. Then I remembered the whisper behind the door, the cold certainty in my sister's voice, the urgency in my father's. Get rid of her. One evening, I stood in the hallway and listened as my parents talked softly in the kitchen. I couldn't hear the words clearly, but I didn't need to. The tone was enough. Controlled, focused, like people who believed they were close to the finish line. That was when I understood it fully. The truth wasn't something they were hiding from me out of habit. They were hiding it because my knowing would stop them, or slow them down, or force them to share something they didn't want to share at all. I wasn't a daughter to them anymore. I was a risk. I went back to my room and sat down, my mind racing but my hands steady. Fear was still there, but it no longer ruled me. Clarity had taken its place. They had a plan. That much was obvious. And if I confronted them now, they would only tighten their grip. So I decided to do the one thing they didn't expect. I would let them think they were winning. I stopped asking questions. I stopped reacting. I played my role the way I always had, dependable and quiet. And all the while, I watched more closely than ever before. Whatever truth they were hiding, I would find it. And when I did, it wouldn't be by accident. The house changed after that, not in any obvious way, but in the way a room feels after someone has made a decision you weren't invited into. Doors closed more often, conversations ended the moment I appeared. Even the air felt tighter, like everything was being measured now. My mother became emotional in a way that felt strategic. Every sigh carried weight. Every comment about how hard things were came with a glance in my direction, as if I were both the problem and the solution. She talked about sacrifice constantly, about how much parents gave up for their children, about loyalty, about how families had to stick together when things got difficult. "You understand that, right?" she asked one afternoon, her voice soft but pointed. "I do," I said, and meant something very different than she thought. My sister took a different approach. She started rewriting me in small ways, planting ideas that didn't sound dangerous on their own. She joked that I'd been forgetful lately, mentioned how stressed I seemed. Once in front of our parents, she laughed and said, "You know how she gets when she's anxious. She reads into everything." I smiled and let it pass. But inside, something hardened. They weren't just managing information anymore. They were managing perception. My father stayed quieter than both of them, which worried me the most. He watched more than he spoke, stepping in only when necessary, correcting details, steering conversations away from certain topics. He was the anchor holding their story in place. The first time he brought out the paperwork, he did it casually. "I need your help with something," he said one evening, placing a thin folder on the table between us. "Just some routine documents. The bank's been asking questions." I opened the folder slowly. The language was dense, legal, full of phrases meant to sound harmless if you didn't know what to look for. Authorization, temporary adjustment, consent. It was framed as administrative housekeeping, nothing more. "Do I need a lawyer for this?" I asked lightly. The room went still. My father's jaw tightened. "That won't be necessary." My sister rolled her eyes. "Why do you always make things complicated?" My mother reached for my hand. "We're just trying to protect everyone." Protect everyone, not me. I didn't sign that night. I told them I was tired and wanted to read it more carefully. They didn't like that, but they accepted it, barely. I could feel their patience thinning. Over the next few days, the pressure increased. The folder reappeared on the counter, then on the coffee table, then on my bed, as if it had walked there on its own. My father mentioned deadlines. My mother mentioned consequences. My sister mentioned how difficult things would become if we didn't act quickly. They weren't threatening me directly. They didn't have to. Everything was implied. I read the documents late at night, alone in my room, cross-referencing terms on my phone, following threads that led to answers they hadn't expected me to seek. The more I read, the clearer it became. Signing wouldn't solve a problem. It would remove me from it. This wasn't about helping the family. It was about clearing the path. One afternoon I came home to find my room subtly disturbed. Nothing missing, just shifted. A drawer not quite closed. Papers no longer in the order I'd left them. They'd been searching. Not for anything specific, maybe, just checking, measuring how much I knew. That was when I understood the timing, the urgency, the whispers. They weren't afraid of confrontation. They were afraid of delay. At dinner that night, my father set the folder down one last time, his tone firmer than before. "We can't put this off any longer," he said. "We need to move forward." "With what?" I asked. "With stability," my mother said quickly. "With clarity," my sister added. I looked at the three of them, really looked, and saw how tightly they were aligned, how practiced this moment was, how certain they were that this was the end of the conversation, not the beginning. For a brief moment, I considered refusing outright, standing up, saying no, demanding explanations they weren't prepared to give. I imagined the fallout. Raised voices, accusations, threats wrapped in concern. I imagined being forced out anyway, only without preparation. That was when I realized refusing wasn't strength. Not here, not now. Strength was choosing the ground I fought on. "I'll sign," I said quietly, "but not tonight." Relief flickered across their faces before they could stop it. It was quick, but I saw it. They thought control had been restored. "Tomorrow," my father said, nodding. "That's fine." That night I packed a bag. Not everything, just what I needed. Clothes, documents, a few personal things that mattered more than they looked. I hid the bag where they wouldn't think to look, my hands steady, my mind clear. When morning came, I signed the papers without protest. I didn't argue language or ask questions. I handed the pen back calmly, meeting my father's eyes for the first time in days. He looked satisfied. They all did. I didn't stay long after that. I said I needed space. Time to think. They didn't stop me. Why would they? They believed the important part was done. As I walked out of the house, I felt lighter than I had in weeks. Not because I'd lost something, but because I'd stopped pretending I still belonged there. They thought the paperwork was the victory. They thought removal was complete. They were wrong. I had walked into the trap on purpose, and in doing so I had bought myself exactly what I needed: time. The pressure didn't lift after I signed the papers. If anything, it sharpened. The house felt restless, like everyone was waiting for something to click into place. My sister hovered more than usual, watching me the way people watch a problem they believe they've already solved. My mother kept asking if I was all right, her concern dripping with expectation. My father checked his watch constantly, as if the timing mattered more than the outcome. It became clear they weren't finished. They were transitioning. The first accusation arrived, disguised as worry. My sister mentioned she couldn't find something small but personal, a piece of jewelry she rarely wore. She said it casually at first, then repeated it later, louder, with a laugh that didn't sound like a joke. My mother frowned in my direction, not accusing me outright, just wondering aloud how strange it was for things to go missing when everyone was under so much stress. I said nothing. I didn't defend myself. I didn't explain. I watched. That evening, my father called a family meeting. He stood at the head of the table with the same folder I'd already signed, along with a new stack of papers I hadn't seen before. He spoke calmly, professionally, as if we were colleagues instead of family. "We need to settle this properly," he said, "for everyone's protection." My sister crossed her arms. My mother dabbed her eyes. The choreography was perfect. He slid the new documents toward me. "This is just a formality," he added. "It ensures there won't be misunderstandings later." I picked them up and scanned the first page. The language was harsher this time, more final. Words like liability and waiver appeared where they hadn't before. The message was unmistakable. This wasn't about clarity anymore. This was about erasing loose ends. "And if I don't sign?" I asked. No one answered directly. My sister shrugged. My mother looked wounded. My father's voice stayed level. "Then things get complicated." That was the threat. Wrapped neatly, delivered without raising his voice. I felt the weight of it settle over me, heavy but clarifying. This was the moment they'd been building toward. The accusations, the urgency, the paperwork. All of it pointed here. They weren't asking for cooperation. They were forcing a choice. I could feel anger rising, hot and sharp, demanding to be released. Years of swallowed frustration pressed against my chest. I wanted to ask how they could do this to me. How long they'd been planning it. What I'd done to deserve being treated like a liability instead of a daughter and sister. But anger would only give them what they wanted. I looked at my father and realized something that steadied me completely. He wasn't afraid anymore. He thought he'd won, and people who think they've won stop being careful. "I'll sign," I said. The room exhaled. My mother reached for my hand, tears already forming. "This is for the best," she whispered. My sister relaxed back into her chair, satisfied. My father nodded once, efficient and pleased. I signed every page they put in front of me. My hand didn't shake. I didn't rush. I made sure my signature was clear, legible, exactly what they expected. When I finished, I slid the papers back across the table and met my father's eyes again. "Done," I said. Something shifted then, subtle but unmistakable. They stopped watching me so closely. The tension drained from their shoulders. In their minds, the problem had been handled. The risk neutralized. That was when I stood up. "I'm going to leave for a bit," I said calmly. "I need some space." No one objected. Why would they? I'd already given them what they wanted. I went to my room and retrieved the bag I'd packed the night before. It was light, intentionally so. I left behind the things that tied me to that house, the objects that would only slow me down. I took what mattered and nothing more. As I walked through the hallway, I noticed how quickly the house felt smaller, less oppressive. I paused at the front door, my hand resting on the same handle where everything had started days earlier. For a moment I considered turning back, saying something final, something sharp and honest. I didn't. I stepped outside and closed the door behind me. The air felt different immediately. Cooler, cleaner. I stood on the porch for a few seconds, letting the reality of what I'd done settle in. I'd signed away something important. On paper, at least. I'd walked out without a fight, without demanding justice or acknowledgement. Anyone watching would have thought I'd lost. As I drove away, I replayed the scene in my head, not with regret, but with precision. I thought about what I'd signed and what I hadn't, about the assumptions they'd made, about the things they believed I didn't know. They thought the documents stripped me of power. They believed removing me physically completed the process. They didn't understand that the leverage they feared had never been the house or the papers. It had been my awareness. I checked into a small, quiet place that night, far enough away that no one would drop by unexpectedly. I set my bag down, sat on the edge of the bed, and let myself breathe fully for the first time in days. The fear that had driven me since the night behind the door finally loosened its grip. I hadn't been defeated. I'd repositioned. Signing those papers hadn't been surrender. It had been camouflage. It allowed them to move forward exactly as they planned, confident and careless. It bought me time, distance, and the freedom to act without interference. As I turned off the light and lay back, I felt something close to relief. Not because the danger was gone, but because I'd chosen how to face it. They believed they'd gotten rid of me. What they didn't realize was that by pushing me out, they'd lost control completely. The silence was the first thing I noticed. Not the uncomfortable kind that pressed against my ears, but a clean, open quiet that let my thoughts settle for the first time in weeks. I woke up in a small room I didn't share with anyone else, the morning light spilling across unfamiliar walls, and felt something close to safety. No whispers, no footsteps outside my door, no one watching to see what I knew. I made coffee and sat by the window, letting the calm sink in. Leaving had stripped everything down to its essentials. Without the constant noise of their expectations, my mind felt sharper. I could finally think. I pulled out the documents I'd signed and laid them out on the table, reading them again with a clearer head. What I'd given up was real, but so were the things I hadn't. They'd been so focused on removing me that they'd rushed the process, overlooking details that didn't fit their urgency. Assumptions had replaced caution. They believed I was uninformed, emotional, and eager to please. That belief had shaped every move they made, and it had left cracks. I compared the paperwork to records I'd quietly copied days earlier, notes I'd taken when no one was watching. Dates lined up in ways they shouldn't have. Names appeared where I'd never been mentioned before. The truth they were hiding wasn't just financial, it was procedural. There were steps skipped, disclosures avoided, responsibilities shifted without consent. They'd counted on me not knowing enough to ask the right questions. From a distance, I started noticing changes in their behavior. Messages from my mother became shorter, less performative. My sister stopped pretending to check on me at all. My father didn't reach out once. The silence on their end wasn't peaceful, it was strained. Without me there to absorb tension, they had nowhere to direct it. The role I'd played for years didn't disappear, it fractured. I heard through a relative that arguments had become louder, less contained, that my sister had started blaming my parents for things she'd once pinned on me, that my father seemed distracted, preoccupied, snapping over small details. They were unraveling. A few days later, I received a call from someone I hadn't expected. A distant cousin, cautious in her tone, asking questions that didn't sound casual. She mentioned rumors, paperwork, a project moving faster than anticipated. She didn't accuse anyone outright, but the concern was there. "I thought you'd know," she said. "You're usually involved." Usually, not this time. I told her the truth without embellishment, that I'd stepped away, that I hadn't been included in recent decisions. That was all it took. Silence stretched on the line before she thanked me and said she'd look into it further. I hung up and stared at my phone, realizing something important. I didn't have to expose them. I didn't have to push. The truth had momentum now, and it didn't need my voice to move forward. More signs followed, notices, delays, questions that demanded answers they weren't prepared to give. Their plan depended on smooth execution and secrecy. Without me there to quietly fix things or deflect scrutiny, every weakness became visible. Through it all, I stayed still. There were moments when I wanted to confront them, to throw everything I knew back in their faces, to demand acknowledgement, to ask how they could justify what they'd done. But each time the urge rose, I let it pass. I wasn't interested in winning an argument. I was interested in being free. Silence became my strongest position. I spent my time rebuilding routines that belonged to me alone. Work felt different without the constant drain. Evenings stretched longer, calmer. I slept better, thought clearer. I wasn't waiting for their next move anymore. Then the message came. It was brief, careful, and unmistakably cautious. My father. He asked how I was doing. He said things were complicated. He suggested we talk soon. I didn't respond right away. I sat with the phone in my hand and considered how quickly everything had shifted. Days ago, they'd believed removing me solved their problem. Now they were reaching out, uncertain, aware that something wasn't going according to plan. The truth they'd been so desperate to hide was no longer contained. I replied hours later, keeping my response neutral. I said I was fine. I said I needed time. I didn't ask questions. I didn't offer help. The balance of power had moved, and they felt it. That night, as I prepared for bed, I reflected on how different this felt from the anger I'd imagined. There was no thrill in watching them struggle, no satisfaction in their discomfort, just a quiet certainty that I'd made the right choice. I hadn't sought revenge. I'd sought clarity. And in doing so, I'd allowed consequences to unfold without interference. They would come back eventually. I knew that. People who rely on control don't let go easily. But when they did, it would be on different terms. Mine. I turned off the light and lay back, feeling grounded in a way I hadn't in years. Whatever came next, I was ready. Not because I was stronger than them, but because I was no longer trapped inside the story they'd written for me. The truth didn't need revenge. It just needed time. The message arrived late in the afternoon, polite enough to sound unfamiliar. My father asked if we could talk. He said things had become complicated and that it would mean a lot to clear the air. There was no apology in his words, no acknowledgement of what had happened. Just a careful request, as if we were negotiating something fragile. I stared at the screen longer than necessary. Months ago, a message like that would have sent my pulse racing. Now it only confirmed what I already knew. Whatever plan they'd built without me was coming apart. I agreed to meet, but on my terms. A public place, neutral ground, no surprises. He accepted without argument, which told me more than any confession could have. When I arrived, they were already there. My parents sat close together, shoulders tight, eyes scanning the room like they were waiting for someone else to walk in. My sister sat slightly apart, arms crossed, her confidence replaced by something brittle. They all looked smaller than I remembered. We exchanged brief greetings, no hugs, no warmth, just the careful politeness of people who knew the balance had shifted. My father spoke first. He talked about stress, about pressure, about how things had moved faster than expected. He said mistakes had been made, not by anyone in particular, just mistakes. My mother nodded along, dabbing at her eyes, already preparing the familiar performance. My sister stayed quiet, staring at the table. I listened without interrupting, letting the words pass over me. I'd waited years to be heard. I didn't need to fill the silence now. Eventually, my mother leaned forward. "We never meant to hurt you," she said softly. "Everything we did was for the family." There it was. The same justification, repackaged. "For the family," I repeated, "just not including me." The words landed harder than I expected. My father flinched. My sister looked up sharply. "That's not fair," she said quickly. "You don't know how much pressure we were under." I met her gaze calmly. "I know exactly how much pressure you were under. I just wasn't supposed to know about it." Silence settled between us, thick and uncomfortable. My father cleared his throat. "We're not here to argue," he said. "We're here to fix things." "What things?" I asked. He hesitated. The situation, the consequences. Not the betrayal, not the planning, the consequences. I took a slow breath. I'm not here to fix anything for you. My mother's eyes widened. We're still your parents. And I'm still your daughter, I said. Which is why what you did mattered. My sister shifted in her seat. You're blowing this out of proportion. I smiled faintly. You decided I was a problem to be removed. That's not a misunderstanding, that's a decision. They had no response to that. My father leaned back, his composure cracking just enough to reveal frustration. So what do you want? He asked. The question surprised him when I laughed quietly. Not because it was funny, but because it was revealing. He still thought this was a negotiation. I don't want anything, I said. That's the point. My mother reached for my hand across the table, but I moved it away gently. I'm not angry, I continued. I'm not here to punish anyone. I just won't be involved anymore. My sister's voice sharpened. You can't just walk away from your family. I can, I said, and I already did. The realization spread slowly across their faces. They had come expecting tears, bargaining, maybe even forgiveness they could leverage. They hadn't come prepared for indifference. My father tried one last time. We need you, he said, dropping the careful tone. I met his eyes. You needed control, I replied, and when you thought I threatened that, you chose to remove me. That was the moment this ended. My mother began to cry then, real tears this time, but they didn't move me the way they once had. I felt sadness, yes. Grief for what could have been, but not guilt. I stood up slowly, signaling the end of the conversation. I wish you well, I said, but I won't be part of this anymore. My sister looked stunned. My father looked defeated. My mother reached for words that didn't come. I walked away without looking back. Outside, the air felt lighter. I stood for a moment, letting the finality of it settle in. There was no rush of triumph, no surge of victory. Just a quiet certainty that I'd chosen myself. They had lost not because I'd outplayed them, but because they'd underestimated me. They'd assumed fear would keep me tethered. They were wrong. As I drove home, I thought about how much energy I'd spent trying to be enough for people who never intended to see me as an equal. Letting go wasn't cruel. It was necessary. I arrived at my place just as the sun dipped below the horizon, the sky streaked with fading light. I unlocked the door, stepped inside, and closed it behind me. For the first time, the silence felt complete. Whatever happened to them next was no longer my responsibility. My part in their story was over. And in walking away, I hadn't lost a family. I'd gained my freedom. Morning light filtered through the curtains as I sat at the small table by the window, my hands wrapped around a warm cup of coffee. The city outside was already awake, moving at its own pace, unconcerned with what had ended and what had begun in my life. For the first time in years, I didn't feel like I was catching up to something or bracing for impact. I was simply there, breathing, present. Peace didn't arrive all at once. It settled in quietly, in moments I hadn't known to miss, making decisions without checking how they would affect someone else, leaving dishes in the sink without criticism, sitting in silence without wondering if it meant trouble. These were small freedoms, but together they felt enormous. I thought about what family had meant to me growing up. I'd believed it was unconditional, something you endured even when it hurt, something you protected at your own expense. I'd confused loyalty with self-erasure. Looking back now, I could see how easily love had been used to keep me in place, how obligation had replaced care somewhere along the way. Letting go didn't mean I stopped caring. It meant I stopped allowing myself to be harmed in the name of belonging. There was grief in that realization. Grief for the family I thought I had, for the version of myself who kept hoping things would change if I just tried harder. But grief, I learned, doesn't mean you made the wrong choice. Sometimes it simply means you stayed too long. I replayed the moment behind the door again, not with fear this time, but with clarity. If I hadn't paused, If I hadn't listened, if I'd walked in a few seconds earlier or later, I might still be living inside a lie, explaining away behaviors that were never meant to make sense. Listening had saved me. Trusting that uneasy feeling had changed everything. I didn't expose them. I didn't seek revenge or public validation. I didn't need to. The truth reshaped my life quietly, without spectacle. The consequences they faced were the natural result of choices they'd made long before I stepped aside. I didn't create their downfall. I simply stopped holding it up. That distinction mattered to me. I wasn't fixed. I wasn't suddenly immune to pain or doubt. But I was free in a way I'd never been before. Free to define family on my own terms. Free to build relationships rooted in respect instead of obligation. Free to walk away when something felt wrong without needing permission. As I finished my coffee and stood up, I caught my reflection in the window. I looked the same, but I felt different. Lighter, steadier. Like someone who had finally learned to listen to herself. If there's one thing this experience taught me, it's that love should never require you to disappear. Family should never feel like a threat. And when your instincts whisper that something isn't right, they deserve your attention, not your doubt. Some doors close loudly. Others close quietly, the moment you choose yourself. Before this story ends, I want to ask you something. If you had been standing behind that door, hearing the people closest to you talk about removing you from their lives, what would you have done? Would you have walked in and confronted them? Or would you have done what I did and listened a little longer before deciding how to protect yourself? I'd love to hear your thoughts and experiences in the comments. Your stories matter more than you know. If this journey resonated with you, please consider liking the video. It helps these stories reach others who may need to hear them. And if you'd like to stay with us for more real-life family drama stories about boundaries, truth, and reclaiming your dignity, don't forget to subscribe to the channel. Thank you for spending this time with me. Until the next story, take care of yourself and trust your instincts. This story is fictionalized for dramatic effect.